Welcome to the Best Practice AI Boardroom AI Briefing, which we're offering here as one of our 5 sessions at CogX. Delighted to have you here. Thank you very much. A few quick pieces of housekeeping. Firstly, I'm afraid everyone is on mute because of the number of people in the audience. But if you have questions, then please do put them into the chat, which should be on your screen. And we'll make sure that we pick up those questions as we go through and try and answer some of those questions, because we very much want to have as much as possible interactive session. Second thing worth just saying is this is being recorded by CogX, so just be aware that anything you put in the chat will be picked up and be permanent in that sense. So the point of this briefing very much is that the boardroom historically has not spent a huge amounts of time talking about AI, or at least not in a practical sense. And what we're seeing as we move to this stage of the economy, particularly post-COVID-19, is this is increasingly important as a board level discussion. And so we've basically sat down and thought through some of the key narratives that boards need to be thinking about as they enter the world of AI. There are 3 big drivers for this. Clearly, AI is transformational technology, and it's something which is beginning to have a real impact on businesses across the piece, and we'll talk about that. The second thing coming out of COVID-19 is that the recession that follows, or is coming, unfortunately, is likely, like most recessions, to generate a new wave of winning companies, whether those are new startups or whether those are traditional companies that are responding in transformational ways. And it's very clear that increasingly AI is at the center of most of those new platform players going to come through and win the new economy. And the third thing that really is important for boards is that some of those issues around AI ethics and some of the risks attendant on data are going from being relatively esoteric conversations debated by people who attend conferences like this, and increasingly moving towards the sort of issue that will appear on the front page of a newspaper, on the front page of the media, and increasingly that has quite a big risk profile for boards, and boards really need to begin to nail down and think about this. So the point of this session today is to talk about 7 narratives, AI narratives for the board agenda. And the point of what we do at Best Practice AI is we spend a lot of our time effectively translating between the people who do AI and the people at board level to whom this is a new technology and may not fully understand what it involves and envisages. And therefore, we've tried to articulate 7 stories that really bring it to life. So some of the stuff we talk about, many of you will be already aware of it, already be fully understanding what AI is, for example, what the challenges around AI are, but not necessarily how we have that conversation at the board level. So how do you take those conversations and put them at an appropriate level so that boards are really getting involved in what is increasingly one of the vital conversations of our time. So we think there are 7 core narratives that boards tend to like to focus on, and they will vary by board, by situation. Is this an online company that's just taking the next steps, or is this a relatively traditional company that needs to begin to move into this new world? The first question clearly is, what is AI? And we think here one of the real challenges is that the constant media story about sort of silver shiny robot men taking over the world in many ways obscures the real power and the importance of AI, so that Sophie the robot and so on has destroyed the image of the fact that actually this is about very much narrow tools, and how you articulate that in a way that boards understand both the opportunity and the limitations of that is a really important part of the process. The second thing is just to help people understand how companies are using AI. And there's a huge number of things which people are basically understanding around AI and some of the obvious use cases, but really focusing in on where those use cases can work and how they can matter makes a big difference. And that plays to the third question, which is, how do you actually deliver economic value from AI? So it's a big question for boards. So there are endless sort of promises out there about the $1 trillion impact of AI on our economies and our societies, but often companies struggle to make the ROI calculation work for often quite simple AI use cases, and helping people understand that trade-off and what the board needs to do in terms of setting incentives for that, for executives and management, is a key part of that conversation. What then is the impact of AI on corporate strategy? What does it mean as you're entering the next phase of the online industrial revolution? What does that mean in terms of the new players you're competing with? What does it mean when effectively your future may be dictated by an AI? So, Google's ability to, or Facebook's ability to define the future of a whole series of industries increasingly shows the importance of AI and understanding for your strategy, but also how you use it yourself. What then is the impact of AI on your people? And as we enter a period of recession and unfortunately high unemployment, this is going to become an increasingly pointed question. The whole risk of automation coming to people's jobs is something which will be a critical point for boards, partly around reassuring people and helping people through the change, but really in terms of how you recruit and train your people and help people go through a transformation which in many ways will be disconcerting for many people, especially given the dominant media narratives around robot men taking over the world. Sixth then, and this is the bit that really is important for boards, and the one we spend most time talking about, is what are the risks associated with this? So what are the factors when something goes wrong? So when an algorithm makes a mistake or does something which could be which is, for example, potentially impacting on issues around protected characteristics of race or sex or gender or something like that, it's not an algorithm that's going to go to prison. It's not an algorithm that will end up paying the fine. It'll be a board member or someone responsible to the board. And so fundamentally helping boards understand the real nature of risks they face and the regulations they're currently operating under and will operate under is a really important part of the conversation. And finally, there's always this debate about, is there an AI race? They're always taking it up to the next level, which is the sort of the US, China, stroke Europe superpower face-off. And that's an issue which some boards are very interested in, because to some extent it begins to have an impact on the sort of business propositions they put through, especially as governments become increasingly important clients. Now, our work is very much based on being part of the World Economic Forum's team, working on building the Empowering AI Leadership Board Toolkit. We wrote this mostly actually in 2018, based in 2019, and it was launched at Davos this year and is now available online, and we'll have a link to that later. But this very much goes through, from a board perspective, what are some of the challenges and what are some of the key strategies that people need to think about. And the really critical thing is it puts ethics absolutely at the heart of the board agenda for AI, and we think that's a really important lodestone for all organizations as they begin to think through where this goes. We'll talk later about what we mean by ethics, because that can mean different things in different contexts. So very quickly, my name is Tim Gordon. I'm a partner at Best Practice AI. My background is 20 plus years of digital transformation. I've used AI in some of the organizations I've run, and it's something I think increasingly is the future looking forward. My partner is Simon Greenman, who'll introduce himself.
Yes, good afternoon. Pleasure to be here. My background briefly is 20 years of international digital transformation across US and Europe. I sit on the World Economic Forum's Global AI Council. As Tim indicated, we've done a lot of work with them on the board toolkit. Also spend a lot of time on the innovation startup in the UK as an advisor to Seed Camp and running various angel groups. So what we're going to do first is briefly jump into the question of what is AI. And we're not going to define AI per se, but rather provide a framework on how we find it is useful to explain to boards and demystify some of it. So a lot of the media narrative is obviously around general intelligence and anthropomorphism of AI, and this is Sophia, that they're going to take over with an existential and providing an existential threat. But we actually find that AI in some respects is much better talked about in terms of narrow intelligence. And this simple example here is of how a high-value use case has been created from AI from a farmer in Japan. Family farm has a lot of manual labor associated with sorting out cucumbers into 7 different types on a production line. They were able to train using some technology from open source technology originally from Google called TensorFlow into 7 different categories of cucumbers, provided an immediate high-value use case with a high-value ROI. And we think it's much more important to talk about narrow intelligence at the board. We also like to frame it in terms of the big shift in AI that's really gone on, because AI is certainly not new, is really over the past 7-8 years, is deep neural networks and machine learning has taken off. And the key point here is really what we have provided in terms of capability is to train AI systems, machine learning systems, based on data. So what we do is give the machine many examples of objects. For example, in terms of vision, we give it examples of an aeroplane, an automobile, a bird, show the actual pictures, and it works out the difference between an aeroplane and an automobile. And it's really, machine learning is allowing pattern recognition at a very high dimensional space. And the big shift this means is, in the past, when you did computer software, you would give the computer the rules and the data, and it would come up with the answers. Now, the fundamental shift that has gone on with machine learning is you give the machine the data, i.e. pictures of automobiles versus birds, give it the answers, and it figures out the rules. And this has really been the big shift here that has given lots of opportunities to create value from AI. The challenge, though, and it's very important, is that the narrative, it means that it's almost like AI is a silver bullet or magic bullet, but actually it is robust. It lacks robustness, and AI is actually quite brittle. So simple example here is if we teach the machine learning that this is a school bus and show it lots of pictures of school bus, it can recognize it when it's head on. But then you rotate the picture of the school bus and suddenly think it's a garbage truck. Rotate it again, it thinks it with 100% probability it's a punch bag, and rotate it again, it's a snowplow. And the key point here is AI is brittle. It is not a silver bullet, and you have to use it with very specific use cases. Now, this comes to life when you start looking at things like Tesla's use of AI, and you can see a simple example where the car system is driving down here, and it suddenly thinks that the puddle that it sees on the screen is actually a solid object and can't drive through it. So again, an example of brittleness, and there's lots of those examples out there. So going on from this is how do companies use AI? And the way we like to describe it from boards is really we're giving cognitive capabilities to computers. They can start to see, they can start to hear, they can read, they can analyze. And think of it in terms of, imagine that you had a million interns that could see, hear, read, analyze within your organization. And imagine that you could improve productivity by orders of hundreds of times. And all of that actually means that you're ending up with a capability in an organization to scaled observation of the world, or in rather more provocative terms, surveillance. It allows you to see and interact with the world at scale. And this is demonstrated very nicely by how AI is being used during the COVID crisis. So some of the examples we see for the use of AI is it helped the world detect the early signs of the COVID-19 in the back end of December, because this company in Canada was able to analyze millions and millions and millions of social media postings, and out of that, the signal for the noise, and saw some chatter around a new virus. Similarly, AI very good in doing things like pattern recognition for diagnostics. So we've seen AI used to diagnose symptoms from CT scans of patients' lungs, and even provide triage to overwhelmed doctors. The pharmaceutical industries are using AI to help screen massive drug libraries to help identify compounds. And then we're seeing AI even used in operations in hospitals, cleaning, delivery of food and things. And these are just some of the millions of use cases that AI can have. But what we're also seeing is that concept of surveillance, seeing, hearing, is in China and South Korea and Taiwan, we're seeing thermal screening in stations and airports. As people walk through, it will be able to detect a person and be able to read their temperature. And even the use of drones at distance can identify fevers at distance, and also can detect crowds. Other examples is facial recognition technology started to fail first when COVID came out as a mechanism to implement quarantines, but quickly it was reprogrammed so you could actually do facial recognition to detect those that weren't wearing masks and help enforce quarantines. And then another example is enforcing social distance. And here you can see that the AI is identifying it's seeing and identifying people in the crowds. And then with the identification of the people, it can then actually see whether or not there are risks around keeping social distance. So it's looking, seeing, hearing around the world. So we believe that AI becomes a general purpose technology that will fundamentally enable and be woven into a vast number of use cases. There isn't any one use case. There's almost an infinite number of use cases because it is a general purpose technology. We don't have time to go into it today, but broadly, we've done a lot of mapping of use cases at Best Practice AI, over 700 use cases and 1,200 case studies. But what we've done is gone through functions such as HR, what are the top use cases, customer service, top use cases, sales, marketing, operations, and so on. So feel free to go to our website to actually take a look at those top use cases. So I'll shift over, and Tim, unless there's any particular questions here that you can
There's
see.
some great questions. I think probably, though, we can either deal with those as we go through, or alternatively, we might save them up for later, because I think they're more talking actually about governance of AI, which we'll come to later on. Sorry, one question for Lily McCann. Some might say that it's detailed analysis at scale is just it in AI. Do you have any showcases of where AI was used as a predictive tool?
Have we any examples of, any examples
where
of AI?
AI was used as a predictive tool? Can you maybe just give a couple of examples of that?
And one way of really thinking about AI, and there's a great book called Prediction Machine by Josh Gaines, is you can think of everything AI does in terms of predictions. So let's go to marketing. Can you predict customers that are likely to churn? Can you predict prospects that are likely to convert? Can you predict the likelihood of me having a certain disease based on this ad? Can you predict the likely demand in the supply chain? So I think a very good way of framing AI and its use is think of problems and construct them as prediction problems. And as you start to look at that framework and go through your organization, you suddenly see there are many, many use cases built around prediction. The key to prediction is obviously having the data to be able to determine patterns. And the more data and the more quality data, the better the predictions that you can build there.
Great, thank you. So I think one of the things that consistently comes across in AI as we look at our work, is that if you look at the sort of predictions out there, there are vast trillion-dollar predictions. So this number is probably out of date now, but Gartner, I think last year, predicted that the business value of AI would be 3.9 trillion by 2022. And McKinsey's got similarly large numbers out there. The challenge I think we find, though, is that very often organizations are struggling to make the ROI work on individual use cases. Simon, can we step aside? And so making sure that we get that right is often a challenge for organizations. And part of what's going on here is that that actually, to some extent, getting our AI right is a question of almost built rather like an iceberg. So to get the proof of concept up and running is expensive, takes time. You need data scientists, so scarce resources. You may need a fair amount of compute power. You need to clean the data up and so on. But once you've got the proof of concept up and running, transforming that into something that works operationally at scale inside an organization is a massive shift. And so we see a huge number of current startups and corporates using AI stuck in this sort of proof of concept purgatory where they may have 8, 9, 10, 20 almost science experiments up and running, but transforming that into the hardcore of the operations of the business is a really big struggle. So there's at least one financial service player we spend time with, and they've got a whole series of proof of concepts out there. They've only probably got one or maybe just about 2 actual use cases which are in full production and affecting the business. So there's a real challenge here with the cost, and they've got hundreds of data scientists, a real cost of how you make this happen. And so when you think about what's going on, Simon, next slide, please. We can see that you've effectively got the challenge, which is that competitive advantage in AI is as much about being ready to do AI as actually doing the AI. If you think about Google, Google basically is probably one of the world's leading AI companies. They spend a fortune on data scientists, they spend a fortune on DeepMind, and they've got huge resources globally focused on this. But fundamentally what they're doing with AI is they're taking an existing process, an existing business with great plumbing of data, and they're improving it by 2%, 3%, 5%. And it's that ability to basically improve the business on top that gives them a real competitive advantage in AI. But underlying that, they have a massive set of data plumbing. They have an entire business that's organized around data and data flows, which you then apply AI to. And so when the real challenge we see here is that building the proof of concept might take 6 weeks, it might take 2 months. You can move very quickly when you've got enthusiasm and bright people in the room. The challenge, though, is to get the underlying process and the data ready for the next stage is actually a large, often quite traditional transformation process that might take 6 to 18 months to get to the right sort of place. So getting that data plumbing in place is a real challenge. And what we're seeing for companies is that often that means it's hard to really make the investment. So we've gone through a period where a whole bunch of people have actually invested in AI because it's kind of an interesting science tool. It's the sort of thing which people come back from conferences like this and get very excited about and say, let's go and do something. But actually to go from there to something that really works in the organization, you need to put consistent investment into the underlying technology. And given the choice between maybe an additional investment in a few more salespeople or a bit additional investment in a bit more marketing versus actually spending it on underlying transformation is fundamentally a challenge. And as we'll see, that sets up a real competitive challenge for organizations going forward. But making sure that organizations understand the long-term vision of where they're going, and this is where the board is so important, is absolutely critical to get there. Now, to get there, we think 6 things need to be aligned. Firstly, you need to have the right plan. So what's the vision and what are you trying to do? So right down to the detail of setting up an individual case, you need to really understand what it is you're trying to predict. What is the number you're trying to get to? What is the thing you're trying to capture? And more broadly, what then is the business plan that sits around that? So there's a whole bunch of sort of AI case studies that don't often have business plans attached to them. And if you don't have a financial number attached to them, it's very hard to really continue to build the consensus and support around this sort of project, especially as we enter a period where resources are likely to become more constrained in most businesses. Secondly, you need to mobilize the right people, and clearly this is an element where the board needs to worry about it. And this has got a whole series of legs to it. Obviously, data scientists are an important part of the story, and getting people who often are paid very high salaries can be a challenge in some organizations. But actually, that's only the tip of the iceberg. You also need to have the right data engineers in place to support them. And then really you need the business ownership and the business experts involved. And often you need middle managers who really understand the detail about processes and projects to buy into this. And that, as we all know, from corporate change is always a challenge. The next two things I'm sure you're all aware of is that having the right data is critical. Data in some ways has been described as the new oil. We see it actually more as the new property. It's there to be developed and do something with it. And you need to have the right tech in place to make sure that the things are aligned and you can really move faster on this. Now, increasing amounts of this stuff can basically be brought in from the cloud. There's a whole series of tools that are very readily available, but making sure that the underlying tech as well is critical. Because when you get to the fifth phase, which is operationalizing it, this is where the real challenges appear. Now, typically, as with all corporate transformations, this comes down to people at the end of the day, but making sure you've got the buy-in and you've got the incentive set up around this is critical. And finally, in particular, the board managing the risks. And this needs to be part of the conversation from the beginning, which is when you're piling into this data, what are some of the inherent risks or biases that might be captured? What are some of the regulatory issues that are going to come up? What are the questions around data privacy? What are the questions on all these various things which enthusiastic management teams and enthusiastic data scientists can go a long way down the track before they actually get there? Now, there's a huge amount more in terms of operationalizing and delivering this stuff. We actually have another presentation tomorrow on AI for the C-suite, which will far more be focused on some of these operational questions and bringing this stuff to life. So do please join us tomorrow if this is something that you'd like to focus on more. And looking forward, what's the impact on corporate strategy? And it's worth taking a step back maybe and thinking about some of the players who really are beginning to evolve in this space. What AI enables corporates to do is to break some of the core trade-offs that 20th century businesses had to make. So in the 20th century, and this is a broader digital point, but it's very, very true with AI, which is traditionally businesses had to choose when you're making a customer proposition, are you offering speed, scale, or scope? If you're offering scope, that's personalization. So think about the maitre d' or the concierge at a hotel who offers you a very, very personalized proposition that's entirely good for you and for you alone. Speed, well, actually, that's typically how do you get something to people immediately. Coca-Cola around the 20th century with the concept of within arm's reach of desire, which literally is wherever you are in the world, you can go and find a Coke and the product is available immediately. And scale, and Henry Ford is the prime example of this. You get scale on something and you can really build it. You can drive costs down and fundamentally you therefore offer the lowest price and real benefits on that front. Now think about Amazon. Amazon offers all three of those things in their mix. So you have a personalized proposition. Usually that is, you bought a washing machine yesterday. Would you like to buy another washing machine tomorrow? But you can see where it's going in terms of the personalization and getting it right. Speed in terms of their ability to get things fast, and scale, clearly they've built that in terms of looking forward. I'm thinking about the sort of companies that operate in the space, and we can see some of the platform companies that are emerging. Simon, maybe the next slide. We can see that you've got a whole series of data native platform companies that are positioned to exploit AI. The boards, as they look up from what's coming out of this coming recession, these are the companies that increasingly are worrying them as the economic advantages they built up over the past decade get increasingly strong. And you've got a whole series of traditional US platforms we spent a lot of time talking about, and some of those obviously have got challenges in the new world, but the underlying data still makes them very strong. And then you've got some of the emerging Chinese competitors. And companies like Alipay, for example, the small blue ant there, that's basically now almost one of the largest financial services institutions in the world on the basis of having built a really strong data play focused around the customer, which enables them to fundamentally understand what's happening with their customers and break, as I say, those trade-offs that historic banks have had to face between are they a sort of a mass market bank offering scale or a very specialist bank offering something else. And they've really been the ability to drive that to the next level. The next slide, please, Simon. And so what you're seeing with AI companies is that they're able to exploit AI flywheels. And the AI flywheel economics is very strong. You start with more data. More data fundamentally means you get more learning. And with more learning, you can deliver better products. And better products means you get more customers. And more customers means you get more data. And so the flywheel continues. And all of this, particularly in the context of startups, means you get more talent and more capital. So we work with boards, for example, that sometimes have been very focused on driving profitability in their business or very focused on driving returns to shareholders. That's great. But if you're competing with someone who's focused on this and using this largely historically for equity valuation, that can be a real corporate challenge as you begin to think through the shift you need to go through in the era of AI. Next slide, please. So I don't want to go into great detail on this, but we do think this begins to have quite big impacts on your organizational design. So products become solutions, where once you had Mercedes producing cars and selling you a car, increasingly they'll be selling you a taxi service or a car hire. So there's a real shift as you move from focusing on the product to using data to focus on the customer. And the customer and building stuff around the customer, which AI enables you to do, is a fundamental value shift. Second is AI factories increasing at the core of the enterprise. If you begin to think of data as being effectively your core of your business and the data flow that goes with it, then the factory that churns that round becomes critically important. Think about Uber. Uber, for example, has moved the means of production from the heart of the business, which would be a traditional place to have it, to the borders of the business. So they no longer actually employ their drivers. They no longer employ a huge chunk of the traditional means of what that business would be. They're focused on the data and the algorithms at the heart of it, and they run a very asset-light business. And that really shifts the way you need to think about your corporation. And third is the virtual value chain becomes an ecosystem, by which we mean if out there's someone who is using, and you'll increasingly see that some of the startups and the new providers are doing things better than you might be doing it. So, for example, if you're trying to do video interviews, the company that does that better is going to be the company that's doing that across multiple places and multiple sources. If your traditional source of competitive advantage, maybe as a bank or as a leading consulting firm, was you recruited the best people, in an era where actually someone else has got better insight to the data around that, it begins to fundamentally change the nature of how you compete and where you play. And often your role will be actually orchestrating multiple suppliers who can do this sort of thing for you. So any questions at this stage, Simon, before we move on?
There is a question from Hannah Geacock, which is basically most companies don't seem to have enough data to make predictions about their customer employees. What is your advice for them? E.g., utilize open data, use tech giant data, or maybe, and I would suggest this, getting it from a vendor who's specializing in the product. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, there's lots of ways to think about this, and we tend to sort of think that there's actually a debate here, which is where does data potentially give you competitive advantage and where do you have easy access to it? So there's a whole series of places where data, for example, you witness a competitive advantage and you should literally buy the service in. So I don't know, helping do your accounts payable better or maybe doing some aspects of HR. But most people don't think of their business at the moment, the data that comes to their business being suitably valuable. So the data, to some extent, is an exhaust fume that comes out of the back of the business. And they'll go and look at legacy data and they'll try and work out what happened with their customers or what happened with their sales. And they'll almost use historic data to try and look at things. The companies that are really getting to the right sort of place for this are fundamentally making the data the heart of what their business. So they're almost consuming their fumes as they go, and they're building those iterative loops around the data. So going back to that AI flywheel, understanding how you can build that flywheel around your data is what will give you a competitive advantage. When you buy data in or you use other people's data, it's very hard to build sustainable competitive advantage. Now, you may need to do that in the short term to get yourself up and running, to build the right culture and so on, and then over time, feed more of your data in. But really thinking through how you use your data for competitive advantage is often at the core of these conversations.
Yeah. And there was another question for whether or not copies of the slides will be available later. My suggestion is feel free to email either Tim or I, so tim@bestpractice.ai, and we'd be happy to send you questions. There was one more question around predictions, and it's going back to earlier, which is, yes, we can frame the world, we can frame a lot of AI in terms of predicting customer churn and the like. But when do we get from predictions to optimizations, away from predict to actually optimization? In other words, I interpret this, how do we move from sort of predictions to actions? And how do we turn AI into action? And we're not going to touch upon that a lot here. We will tomorrow on our C-Suite section. But there's a big question mark that Tim raised is how do we operationalize this? How do we take AI algorithms, AI technologies and products and integrate it into the human workflow? So making the human machine interface work. So for example, in terms of customer predictions, it might say this segment of customers has an 80% chance of churning. You would then need to design some sort of program to take action on that customer churn. So it really relates to the bigger question of how do you integrate prediction technologies into workflow to take action. I don't know if you have anything else to comment on, Tim.
No, I think that makes sense. I think one of the challenges on AI is that a lot of technologies sort of get ramped in together with it. So AI is not the same as robotics or RPA or something like that, which often are the tools which sort of support it. The way we sort of think of it is that AI in some ways is the apex technology for the fourth industrial revolution. So there's a whole series of underlying technologies coming down the track, Internet of Things, robotics and so on, drones, and actually AI to some extent is the bit which brings those things to life and fundamentally breaks down the barrier between the computer and the real world. So this whole concept we discussed earlier of this being an ability to look at the world through a computer without a human being need to be in between really means that this begins to be something that empowers these other technologies that enables things to happen. So, for example, cobots on production lines, whereby robots used to sort of not be able to be near humans because they would swing around and brain them. Fundamentally, the ability to build computer vision in means you can move to a world where these technologies begin to work together. And that is one of the things that makes AI so powerful. It's a sort of underlying supportive technology to a whole series of other technologies that are up and running. So that sorry.
So, yeah, it's a nice segue to the whole issue of risk. And
also
the future of work. Yeah.
So there's a huge amount more happening here, and actually there's a whole series of sessions at CogX, so we're not going to dwell on this very quickly. But we do think for a board this is a really important part of the story, because part of the issue with AI is that the story that most people read is around, it's a sort of Terminator 2 story, or it's a robot's coming for our job. And part of what boards need to do, particularly when they're deploying technology like this, is have a very open and transparent conversation with people around where's it going and what could it lead to. And we fundamentally believe, obviously, there are four sort of scenarios you can imagine. One is around automation, where the algorithm replaces human beings. And this is one that sort of probably in terms of sort of robot lines and sort of chatbots and so on is the one that a lot of people focus on. And in certain use cases, this is a tool that is happening, but probably it's less powerful in terms of driving costs out at the stage than some of the other ones. There's the platform economics where effectively algorithms manage the humans. And this is the sort of stuff you read about in terms of people working incredibly long hours in Amazon warehouses, or Uber drivers feeling sort of oppressed by their algorithmic overlords. And part of this, I think, is how we keep making sure that humans are very much part of this loop, and that the managerial conversation takes place that doesn't just outsource it all to algorithms. And there have been cases of people literally being made redundant by algorithms. And we fundamentally believe that boards that go down that road are sacrificing the long-term trust that is critical to actually making these sort of tools work well and be supported across the organization. The next one, which I think someone in the questions referred to, is actually the sort of combination of human plus algorithm. And Garry Kasparov is obviously the chess player who, to some extent, for a while was the poster child of human brilliance being beaten by a computer. He's written a lot, and he's good books on this actually, around what really works is a human plus an AI. In many ways produces more powerful outcomes than either humans on their own or AIs on their own. And now you begin to think about the way in which the AI works. We described it earlier. So the ability, for example, to get better at predictions, that's not actually an entire job. There aren't many people whose job is to sit there and do predictions. There aren't many people whose entire job is to sit there and just look at data and make those predictions. But what it does do is it informs people, and it gives a superpower to people, which is if you're someone who does lots of these things, it gives you the ability to do triage and work out where you need to focus. And so a huge amount of AI, and to Simon's point earlier around the brittleness of AI, is actually the power of AI is often it does that triage that enables you to deploy your best people, or your real focus on those edge cases where it's not quite clear, is that an interloper, is that a problem, or is it something that's happening? And the final one is creative economy, which I think we're just at the beginning of understanding, which is how can we use humans plus algorithms to create stuff that actually is far better. So whether it's around sort of algorithmic art or whether it's around algorithmic music. There's a whole series of places where the human plus the algorithm together could work in all sorts of ways that means 1 + 1 really does equal 3. So we think that's key. But the underlying thing that we kind of know is matters across all of this, and often we end up being asked sort of on the sidelines, what should my children study at school or whatever, or what should they study at university to be ready for this new world? It's that flexibility and willingness to learn that is going to be key both for individuals and for organizations.
Next area we're going to focus on, which gets a lot of attention, is really risk around AI. And there's been a number of questions already on governance, guardrails, and the like to make sure. And if we look at the broad sort of narrative around AI, you hear things about AI as unethical, it's existential, there's a lot of risk. So we're going to spend a bit of time putting some structure around that and what it means. And we've got a video with no sound on this one, so I'll talk over it. But this is an example of using some technology from the US to help analyze candidates who are being interviewed through a machine, through a video interview, looking at emotion recognition to detect there's certain characters and attributes, looking at their tone to see their personality and their forcefulness. And out of it all, in this video interview process, they're going to come out with a recommendation as to whether or not this person should be hired for sales. Now, that sounds like a wonderful idea because as a high-value use case, it works very well. You're doing lots of repetitive tasks around interviewing. It's lots of data. There's lots of CVs. There's lots of time. This is something that could be automated very well. Makes a lot of sense. But the reality, this is a minefield of potential risks that do need to be made aware at the board level and some level of governance put in place. So at a high level, the types of risks that we look at, and we worked on the World Economic Forum's board toolkit around this, is we really break it into 3 major types of risks that should be considered by the board. Strategic is basically if you don't embrace AI and the business models, does it risk your existence? Because AI can fundamentally allow disruptive new business models. The second types of risks are operational. That, for example, in decision making, does AI make bad decisions or predictions, and what is the impact? Customer service. Many examples that we see of implementing AI are around chatbots. If the chatbots aren't very good, does that risk your customer experience? Security is another big area. Adversarial attacks you might have heard about. So there's a lot of, and safety as well, does this work? There's a lot of sort of operational risk. And the third area that probably gets the most attention is the legal and ethical. We've all heard about bias, that the algorithms are biased. And in some ways that simplifies things because it's not that the machines are biased. The machines have been learned to make their recommendations based on historic human behavior. So if historically your hiring has been biased over the past 10 years and you feed that historic data into the machine, guess what? It picks up on human biases and it amplifies them. So we don't think machines are biased per se, but rather they amplify and reflect societal biases. There's also risks around regulation coming down the road, big push on data privacy, and GDPR came in 2 years ago. That does relate to AI. Product liability risks, contract risks. We have a session later today where one company was claiming that it has an AI company that was fantastic at trading. Guess what? That company lost £25 million. The company was sued. Who is responsible at this point? Is it the algorithm, the company, and how much damages should be put in place? There's a lot of stuff around risks here. So I think we'll just stick to one area here, and we have a session later today with a panel of 4 experts in risk if you want to join that, because it is a deep topic. But the main one we hear about is ethical AI risks. And if you look around the world, there's been multiple organizations, frameworks to put in place AI ethical principles for organizations. The British government and the UK strategy is very much focused that the UK will be one of the best places to do ethical AI, as is the European Union, is how do we make for trustworthy AI environment. But the 4 big sort of principles that we want of our AI is it inclusive? diversive, and fair. And this very much reflects the theme of the whole overall CogX conference. And it's a theme that's being amplified, obviously, in the COVID-19 situation. Another big area, and this is really important because it gets into regulatory, is for algorithms that are being used to make important decisions, we need to be understood and explain how those algorithms work. So if the algorithm recommends that a company hires me and not Tim, why? So explainability and transparency. AI also needs to be, third point, be safe. It should be socially beneficial, responsible design and default. So as your organization is building AI systems, how do you make sure that the checks and balances are built in and also it's being designed for responsible purposes? Now, we're not going to have time today to go into it, but Tim's point on people raises a big question around training. How do you train and who should you train around ethical and responsible AI? Well, the data scientists, the engineers, definitely, managers. It's great to have, I would say, an hour-long course on ethics of AI for board members because this is such a big topic. But at the end of the day, the most important principle is AI is actually accountable to people. And so if something goes wrong and there is a need for recourse, who do you go to in the organization? And this ultimately filters up to the board level here. So a lot of principles that need to be turned into policy, that needs to be turned into practice and operationalized. One thing that we find is not very well known is that AI regulation is already here. People talk about AI being regulated. No, it is already regulated. There's obviously a lot of specific laws in heavily regulated industries such as financial and healthcare. But even under GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, Article 22 says that if you make fully automated decisions such as hiring, loans, credit, that sort of thing, they have to be explainable. And that exists today. So there's a lot that we could go through here, but unfortunately we don't have time. But one of the case studies that we really like is what Deutsche Telekom is doing for their digital ethical programs. First of all, they believe that digital ethics is a differentiator for their strategically. And if you look at the satisfaction and trust ratings for their organization, off the chart. So they put in place a number of programs here around internal processes. They have a digital ethics center. To roll out AI, you need a seal of approval, so it's gone through a checklist. You need supplier management guidelines so that when you're procuring AI from vendor, you're not running into risks. And there's a lot of intrinsic inherent risks in going to small vendors, especially. They have a lot of communications and events and a lot of training and formal policies. We really like what Deutsche Telekom is doing here, and we think it's really the vanguard and something to watch for the rest of, for many other organizations. So that's basically it. We won't go into time here, but from the World Economic Forum's work, we do have a checklist of things that boards could do and also C-suites could do to put in place good governance and guardrails. But none of this will be really surprising. It makes a lot of sense, but it just needs to be spelt out. And it should be put in the context of your existing sort of enterprise risk management processes here. But education is required around the specific risks of AI. I don't know, Tim, if there's any questions around
the top question in terms of people asking is from Gary Bernstein, which is how will AI impact corporate governance?
Yeah, I think the main thing around corporate governance is we're going to have to make sure that the risks of AI are reported up to the board. So, and also board members need to make sure that they have a good programs in place. So looking on the left here, does the board, number one, understand what the risks are around AI? Has the management actually conducted a risk review? Are there ethical codes put in place in the organization? Do you need to set up a new sort of governance committee around this, or can you put AI on the enterprise risk management risk ledger, that sort of thing? But I think the main thing for boards is having the confidence that their organization is educated around the risks of AI and has government programs in place and is reporting out. But the risk if you get AI wrong, and you say this, Tim, is the reputational damage and ultimately stock price damage that can occur is absolutely huge if you don't have this governance in place.
And I think just building on that, one of the things I think fundamentally is coming as a sort of side effect of all this is more transparency. So the company that I think Simon may have referred to earlier that basically ran a algorithm to improve its recruitment processes based on 10 years worth of historic data was never able to make it work because it turns out that if you were a white or possibly Asian young male, you were far more likely to be recruited for a whole series of jobs. And therefore, what was emerging is that clearly, historically, there'd been a consistent bias against employing women. And so what you saw there was that if you'd been captain of a male volleyball team, that was worth more points if you'd been captain of a female volleyball team. Now, that on one level is a sort of an algorithm and a bit embarrassing. On a deeper level, actually probably sets you up for a whole series of quite big legal conversations. If you're the board, you would want to be asking some pretty hard questions around the underlying practices in the business. And so you move from a world where you can say, oh, it's just a bunch of bad apples and, this is all anecdotal. Actually, very hard mathematical evidence of some of the underlying structural issues that probably we're increasingly aware of in terms of what's happening in our society at the moment. And I think that if it's handled the right way and it's turned into a positive conversation, is potentially one of the real upsides of this increasing focus on data and AI. And I think this sort of plays to a point we'll come to later, which is I think the key role for the board increasing this age in corporate governance is how do you ensure trust is there in the business? And how do you make sure that actually the business is fundamentally trusted? We'll come to later. If you're not trusted, there is a real economic impact of that. And that's something which I think is going to be true across all your sets of stakeholders. And it's something that boards are therefore going to have to increasingly focus on this. And the challenge, the very specific challenge, is often there may be an understanding gap between what the board members at the moment understand and what actually is happening inside the organizations, where you've got sort of people coming in with new ideas around sort of taking the data and really running with it. And that's very much why we think this is such an important board conversation, to make sure that those gaps of knowledge and understanding are really closed. So moving on.
So at 4 o'clock today, if you want to dive into this more, we actually have another panel discussion which gets experts in this topic to take a deeper dive from ethics, legal through operational risks.
So just quickly, I think one of the sort of the questions that emerge, particularly for big international companies, is there a race for AI dominance? What does it mean as you look across the world? And on the next slide, Simon, we can see the best practice of AI cut at the layers of the AI industry and where value is captured. And we sort of talk to this in terms of, AI chips, AI cloud, and AI algorithmic services. I think big picture, what we're seeing here is that one moderately cynical approach to the AI industry is that actually it is largely a play by some of the big cloud vendors to get people excited by this new technology so they move on to the cloud. And if you look at something like Amazon, the huge chunk of the value in Amazon is being fundamentally driven by Amazon Web Services. And they're providing on the basis of that a whole series of free tools and a lot of marketing, a lot of stories about why AI is so important to shift companies onto the cloud. And fundamentally, that at the moment is where the bulk of the money and bluntly in AI is being made, which is people being switched onto the cloud, onto what fundamentally is a real estate play. But you've then got a series of people emerging doing the horizontal enterprise AI, the vertical industry AI, and that increasingly is a place where I think if people are thinking about deploying AI in their organizations, often going to some of these service vendors who won't necessarily be selling you AI, they'll be selling AI-powered services, is increasingly one of the fastest and best ways to begin to get involved in this. And it's worth noting that buying a service here is not the same as buying traditional software. The data discussion here is a far more sophisticated one than you would have with most traditional software. And often for startups, there is much buying the ability to learn from you as they are getting cash when they work with you. But this is an area where boards, I think, need to understand what some of these trade-offs are, because we're observing that, for example, legal departments often don't get these trade-offs in terms of how they take things forward. And then AI in corporates is increasingly become a driver of value and increasingly being seen as something that will really begin to impact on the top line. So we're working with clients in industries a million miles away from data in terms of traditionally how you view them. And they're looking at the world and going, look, the really valuable companies are all data driven. We need to get there as well. But the sort of the big question at the moment in the background is this China versus US and this sort of formulation of, is AI the new Cold War? And to some extent, AI has become this it's almost the critical question mark. It used to be once, who's got more nuclear missiles? It's almost now who's got more AI data scientists. And you're seeing this race between China and the US. And I've not read the book by Kai-Fu Lee about AI superpowers. I highly recommend it. The worrying thing for those of us, at least sat where I am, but maybe many people on the call as well, is actually this view that Europe almost doesn't matter. So you've got China that's emerging as a massive AI superpower on the basis of scale and volume of data, willingness of government to work closely with people, often relatively new digital infrastructure, and actually concentration of data and power in relatively few big corporates that enable them to do a huge variety of things. So, for example, digital payments are pretty standard in China, and that fundamentally means you've more data to play with and probably less barriers to playing with it. And counter to that, you've then got the US, which obviously has got these big data platforms we talked about earlier in terms of the Googles and the Facebooks and some of the other big Californian plays. And actually Europe is stuck in the middle, and Europe sort of very much has this positioning around regulation and GDPR being our route to remaining relevant in the world. And so there's potential for this three-way sort of world emerging. And these AI systems, on one level they're AI systems, and another level they're actually how we live our lives. And so this is almost three ways of thinking about the world, three forms of culture beginning to emerge. And we see it very explicitly in the COVID crisis, where you've got a seeming greater willingness by the Chinese, for example, to engage data-driven privacy encroaching solutions, and Europe has historically been more resistant to those. So this is something which boards really need to get their heads around as they begin to work at how they play in this transnational mix of things. So just worth saying quickly, data we see as the 21st century equivalent of real estate, and so it's not on its own valuable. It needs plumbing, it needs irrigation, it needs roads, it needs people to work with it, but it is the potential. And so when we think about the board agenda, we come back to some big messages. Firstly, education is key, and I think various people have mentioned this in the chat, so thank you for that. Getting people educated on this is really critical, and educated in ways that don't necessarily need vast amounts of technology is critical. Finland is a country that is already rolling out a process to try and get 5% of the total population educated on AI and data and use that as a way to drive things forward. So there are lots of ways, and there are lots of great people speaking at the CogX Festival who are talking about precisely this, which is how do you get education out there? So it's something that very much needs to happen at different levels in the organization. Second, making sure the right use cases and plans are in place. The board needs to be willing to accept that mistakes will happen. Ideally not mistakes that involve data breaches or nonsense like that, but mistakes in terms of people will be trialing and testing different things, and you almost need a portfolio approach to the various internal projects to make sure that some of those work and some of those don't work. And that's the sort of thing where the board, with its fiscal hat on, needs to be understanding that you will take approaches, you will experiment, and things may or may not work, and they need to understand that the potential organizationally, culturally, is to learn as much from the mistakes as the failures. And that comes down to the next point around the board vision and patience on the economics. It'll take longer than people expect, but the impact potentially will be massive. And they really need to double down into their digital transformation planning. Work with your people, not against them. And I think, if you think about AI being about spotting patterns in data, if people really don't like what you're doing, it is not hard to begin to throw a spanner into the works of patterns in the data. Your middle managers think this stuff is nonsense and they don't believe in it. They will find a million ways to blow it up. They will find ways to stop it happening. And you need the expertise, you need the people on side, and therefore you need to make this a two-way conversation. You need to support your people and really make sure that the education is there to help them get there. And to make that happen, the board needs to show ethical leadership and needs to explicitly commit to this. So the stuff we're seeing around sort of, Facebook's constant travails at the moment is partly because that's not seen as being where historically they've been at. Now, hopefully they are and they're going there. But this is something where you can see how even the mightiest of companies can tumble if they're not seen to be very focused on this. And I think finally, just boards need to be aware that there are these emerging different views around regulation and where the regulation is going to go that will have quite a big impact on both where they develop their tools, where they invest, but also how they deploy them and roll those out across the piece. We're running out of time now, so are there any questions that we need to deal before we get to the final one?
I'll finish up here on trust, Tim. And
okay, so I think the bit that we keep coming back to is we think in the world of AI, trust is going to be the key currency for value creation. You stop and think about the various stakeholders. If you think about your customers, if your customers trust you, they will share more data with you. And if they share data with you, then it gives you a competitive advantage against people who individuals are not willing to share data with. If someone's not willing to share data with you, I have to the question that someone asked earlier, I have to go and buy that data, or I have to find a way to access that data. And fundamentally, that is a more expensive proposition, so my cost base is higher. In terms of suppliers, if you're working with suppliers to, for example, optimize your supply chain, if you're working across the entire ratio of people to work with, they need to trust you to make sure that your systems are talking to each other, that you're sharing data across the piece. And if they think you're simply using this as a way to crush them price or basically drive a better value that's entirely to your interest, they have no incentive at all to share information with you. So this is a world where the more information you're willing to share, the better you are prepared to behave, the real economic returns come to you. Staff, once again, if people are willing to, for example, one of the use cases we've seen is an ability to go through and read lots and lots of emails and work out from that where the challenges and issues are, begin to spot sort of patterns in the data around we've all got a problem with X or there's bottlenecks in the process here. If people don't trust you when you're doing that, you think you're fundamentally doing it just to go through and work out who to bully or who to fire, you'll have real problems. And so fundamentally, that's a big issue. So trust we see as being an absolutely critical part of the competitive edge for companies going forward. And we just observe that it is a crisis like now, when people are forced to make hard decisions, that the real revealed character comes through. The companies that behave well now and are seen to live up to their standards, we think will build the trust that will be critical for the next phase as this AI accelerates away. And the companies that now behave in a way that is short-sighted and seen as being selfish, fundamentally are probably less well positioned for the age of AI.
Got you. So some further reading here that we really recommend. We also have some other sessions coming up, but I'm just looking at questions, and audience, feel free to type in further questions. But there was one, would love to get your view on how AI impacts the C-suite. What would be the role of the CEO and the leadership team in a data-driven business? And so we have the AI for the C-suite at 4 p.m. tomorrow, but what we will cover there, which is really important, the most important decision that the CEO will make is who they appoint to the leadership of AI. And we'll cover some of the organizational dimensions tomorrow. For example, do you set up a center of excellence under a strong leadership to drive and diffuse AI and AI capabilities throughout your organization? And Tim will also touch upon data is really the key to AI. And and Tim talked about as those organizations that fundamentally have a data strategy, a data platform where they're pulling data from all of their customers, their suppliers, their partners. Those that have the data foundational layer are really in a very, very strong position to leverage AI and deliver on the value. But without those underlying foundations, the CEO and the CEO C-suite team will struggle to really capture the potential value of AI. What else do we have?
The other thing just on C-suite is, I think one of the challenges for senior executive leaders is to actually to be able to let go. And this requires huge confidence, because if you've built your career on being the expert because you've got to the top of the organization through how many years and consistently being the expert, being in a world where suddenly you need to trust the data to tell you what the answer is, that requires a level of confidence that is quite strong. And I think that's part of one of the real challenges for executives as they begin to move into this new world, which is how do you let go, how do you trust other people, as well as get them to trust you. Now, we've ended with just our contact details. So there are various questions in here about, can I see the slides and use cases for NGOs and so on. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us and follow up on some of that. We have, in terms of the use case questions, 700 use cases in bestpractice.ai, including for NGOs. So please do go look at that. That you need to register, but it's free to access because we're keen that people understand that. And a key part of that is really making sure that some of the translation, the commercial aspects of AI use cases are also captured and understood there. So I think we close up now, don't we, Simon? But thank you very much.
One more question just coming in. We have 1 minute. How do you ensure AI, given that there's a relative lack of understanding at the board of AI, how do you create almost urgency at the board level around AI so you don't miss the opportunity?
I mean, we've got a session on that once again on Wednesday on AI and COVID. I think the point is a recession is fundamentally a reset moment in the economy. And if you look at previous recessions, typically new winners have emerged out of those recessions. And whether they are new platform plays or whether they're companies that have transformed themselves, it won't be enough to stand still in the same place. And AI is fundamentally, and data and the things that come with it are fundamentally with the heart of building yourself for the next generation. And there's almost, I mean, I started my career in newspapers, and we sort of thought we were the only people going through digital transformation. 20 years later, everyone else is going through it. And so, you came out of the 2000 dot-com bubble, people would have thought that was it. They didn't worry about the internet anymore. 10 years later, the people who didn't invest at that moment were being taken out and were ceasing to exist. So this is a real fundamental moment of survival for companies, so it needs to be on everyone's agenda.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And we hope all of you have a fantastic CogX. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to share this with you. Reach out.
Enjoy CogX.
Bye.
Thank you.